بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله وحده والصلاة والسلام على من لا نبي بعده. أما بعد. So guys, it's been a very long time since I've done a library chat. I've been getting a lot of requests, and obviously it is time to move on and continue the series that I'm doing here. But today's lecture, today's series is actually going to be a continuation of the last 2 or 3 that I've been doing. And so this is your standard disclaimer. First and foremost, this is one of the advanced library chats, and therefore if you haven't studied these issues, if you don't know the differences between Atharism and Ash'arism, if you've never heard of Ibn Taymiyyah and Al-Razi and Al-Ghazali and the differences between them, then really this is not a library chat for you. Also, this library chat is a continuation of the series that I've been doing in the last 3 library chats. So please, if you haven't listened to the fitna of the Karramis, if you haven't listened to the mihna of the Ash'ira, if you haven't listened to what happened in Nishapur, if you haven't listened to the rise of the Seljuqs and the Abbasid Khalifa in Baghdad, and what happened with Al-Kunduri, then please pause here. This video is not going anywhere, inshallah. This is YouTube. Please pause here. Go back and listen to the last 3 library chats: the rise of Sunni kalam, the mihna of the Ash'ira. Listen to how Nizam al-Mulk was about to be chosen. We're just going to get to that in today's lecture, so I need to have that precursor. Also, the standard disclaimer as well that I also gave in the last 2 lectures, I have to give it again, that today's lecture, really it is possible that some people might find that certain phrases are used that they might read into that I'm trying to be diminishing, or that I'm trying to somehow criticize one of the strands of Sunni Islam, but nothing could be farther from the truth. As I have said multiple times, and I believe my track record for the last decade has been very clear in this regard, that I no longer hold and harbor any negative feelings or attitude towards anybody who is in mainstream Sunni Islam. And even though I used to be a little bit more harsher, maybe a lot more harsher, and I used to criticize the Ash'ari group using very negative terminology, that is a past me, and completely factually, I don't view Ash'arism as being anywhere, anyhow, shape or form, some type of bid'i theology, and I view it to be a legitimate attempt to understand the nusus, even though to this day I am still I call myself basically sympathetic to Athari Islam, and one library chat will be about this, by the way. Why do I use these terminologies? It's not just coming out of the blue. It's not just something I'm using to be politically correct. No, I am still sympathetic to Athari Islam, and I believe that it is the easier and the better and the more closer to the fitrah and the more in line with certain aspects that I will maybe discuss in a later library chat. Once upon a time, 15 years ago, more than that, maybe even 17 years ago, I became obsessed with a question. And that question was, how do we understand the dominance of Ash'arism for the bulk of Islamic history? And this obsession resulted in, when I began doing my dissertation, it was especially strong in my Medina phase when I was doing my master's. When I started doing my dissertation, it resulted in me doing a lot of original research for the first chapter, which I called The Rise of Sunni Kalam. And my advisor and my reader were so happy and impressed with that chapter when I handed it in, that in fact my advisor at Yale actually said that he would rather that I stop the dissertation of Ibn Taymiyyah and do my entire dissertation, continue the story, and move on and talk about how Sunni Kalam and how Ash'arism continue to be dominant for post Ibn Taymiyyah, because my dissertation, the first chapter finishes right at Ibn Taymiyyah, and then chapter 2 is Ibn Taymiyyah's Dar al-Ta'arud, and then chapter 3 is the fitra in the Dar al-Ta'arud. I have 3 chapters. So much of my talk today, most of it is a summary from my dissertation, chapter 1 of my dissertation. Now, as I said, I became obsessed with this question for, frankly, sectarian reasons, because I felt that my strand of Sunnism at the time had been madhloom, had been wronged by this notion that there's a dominant strand that is different than my strand. However, during the course of the last 15 years, as is very public and clear, I am no longer wed to only one strand, and I believe that fi kullin khair. And I believe that all of these, including Atharism, including classical Salafism and whatnot, and Hanbali Islam, is actually a human development. That Allah Azza wa Jal did not reveal Atharism or Ash'arism or Maturidism or Mu'tazilism. Rather, these are extractions, these are extrapolations from the Nusus. And because of this, I have lost any animosity to anybody who believes in the Hadith of Jibreel and the Arkan of Iman as mentioned in the Hadith of Jibreel. And I believe that fi kullin khair. And I believe that after this, it's simply a difference of preference and not a difference of we don't have to be harsh, we don't have to be vulgar, whatnot. And I truly believe that it is a historical reality that Ash'arism was dominant for a period of time, and I believe that my dissertation shows why, and it's up to you to take it or leave it. So the point being that I don't believe that the predominance of any one sect within Sunnism is a type of divine sign of approval. It is clear to me as a student of intellectual history that we can easily understand the rise and the appeal of specific strands of Islam at any given time. And we can understand them in light of socio-political circumstances. And the fact of the matter, which is undeniable, is that if certain political realities have not taken place, then certain theological developments would also not have taken place. A simple example, which maybe another library chat will do, will be the example of the 4 schools of law. At once upon a time, there were many schools of Islamic law, but it was a political decision at the caliphate level in the time of the Abbasids, that the Abbasids, for reasons beyond the scope of this library chat, they decided to make a post for each one of the 4 madhabs. And because they chose these 4 madhabs, and they didn't choose any other of the madhabs, they were given a certain boost, and the other madhahib did not get the political backing. Imam al-Awza'i's madhab was very common in Andalusia, and it was almost close to be adopting. Had it been adopted, we would have had the Awza'i madhab as a mainstream madhab of Sunni Islam. However, the Maliki madhab was eventually introduced, and it supplanted the Awza'i madhab, and the Awza'i madhab literally was lost in the annals of history. The same goes for Ibn Jarir al-Tabari, had a madhab as well, but it was not adopted, and therefore it simply withered away. The same goes for the qira'at of the Quran, as it is well known, at one point in time there were 30-40 codified qira'at. Al-Tabari himself wrote a book with 35 qira'at, but codification occurred, that narrow process began, and Ibn Mujahid chose 7. For another 400 years, it was 7 plus a few strands here and there, until finally Ibn al-Jazari came and then said, Khalas, I'm going to add 3 more, and he basically shut the door. That vibrancy is gone. So the point is that, and again, this irks some of my critics who are still in the old phase of thinking that these are strands that Allah revealed, but it's human. You can't deny this, that the intellectual strands of Islam as well were not just 3 or 4 or 5. No, even as I said in my previous library chats, Atharism and Ash'arism and Maturidism and Mu'tazilism and all of the other isms, there are spectrums within them. All of Atharis don't just believe the same thing. All of Ash'aris don't believe the same thing. And where one spectrum ends, the other one begins. So between classical Atharism and classical Ash'arism, you get this gray area where there are figures that are claimed by both schools, and you have your hardliners, and so on and so forth. Point is that the historical dominance of one trend or one madhab over another amongst the elite is not, in my humble opinion, a divine sanction that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala approves of this particular trend. And this is the standard distinction between qada kawni and qada shar'i, if you know that chapter, but we're not going to discuss the qada issues over here. And by the way, those people who claim that because one particular school is dominant over another, this is a sign that Allah loves that particular school, well, all you need to do is to look at the fact that they only use this principle when it comes to their own school. So for example, in recent past, Salafism has had a resurgence, right? And if you log on to most websites, they are Salafi influenced, and the global satellite channels and whatnot. Now, if you happen to be of that persuasion, you will say, oh, this is a divine sign and Allah sanctions and whatnot. And if you happen to be of the other persuasion, you're like, oh, this is oil money and this and that. In the end of the day, no school, the dominance of it can be a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves that school. And the contrary, as I have said publicly, the bulk of the ummah in its simplistic mainstream belief that is pure Islam. As for these advanced issues of the abstract questions of Aqidah that 90% of the Ummah haven't even thought of, much less have answers to, these do not, the majority is irrelevant in this regard, and that it was a mistake and it remains a mistake to have these various schools of Sunnism refuting one another and having some harshness and vilification. And that was a mistake even when it happened, I believe so. And in our times, it is even a more egregious mistake in light of current affairs and in light of the myriad problems that are facing our ummah. The last thing that we need now is a bunch of overzealous teenagers making tabdi' of other Shari'i observant Muslims, practicing Muslims, simply because they disagree over Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa. If you still think that another Muslim who is observing the laws, memorizing the Quran, fearing Allah and His Messenger, loving Allah and His Messenger, is a deviant because they have a different interpretation of Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, then honestly, you've lost the plot and you shouldn't be listening to my library chats anyway, because this is of no use or concern to you, because you have already kicked me off of your narrow stream of the manhaj. So the point is, all of this is an introduction to say that today's library chat, as they say, is for information purposes only, is for nerdy, geeky, intellectual lovers of history, and especially of theological history, and it's not really meant to fuel the fans of sectarianism, a'udhu billah, even though the conclusion, I'm sure, will not be something that some people will like, and it will be something that other people will love, because the conclusion, I'll say it right now, is that the dominance of Ash'arism clearly, without a doubt, and this is not just my conclusion, but I've proven it more than I believe most other researchers in this field, it goes back to specific political events in the 4th and 5th centuries of the Hijrah, well, in particular the 5th century. It goes back to specific political events, and because of those political events, Ash'arism became dominant. It was the right time, the right place. These things happened, which we'll talk about in today's library chat, and because these things happened, it was a domino effect, and for the next 300-400 years, it became the dominant strand, and then the ossification period began, and there was no original thinking for quite a lot of time. So we'll get to that inshallah, maybe in a future library chat. So, any case, that was all the intro, by the way. Bismillah. Now, quickly, the political scenario, because we need to understand what's going on. It does have a role to do with the theological scenario as well. We are now going back to around 900 CE, around 350 something Hijrah, and the Buwayhid, or what is called the Buyid dynasty, was effectively in charge of the Khilafah. The Khilafah is based in Baghdad. Technically, the Abbasids are the Khalifa, but as most students of history should know, the Abbasids really were only powerful independently for the first 150 years. After that, a series of dynasties basically became shadow Khalifas. They didn't call themselves Khalifa, but they had taken charge. The Khalifa became like the Queen of England. Really no power, and rubber stamping whatever the parliament, whatever does. The parliament was not a majority, it was these ruling dynasties. So during from 934 to 1055, 150 years, the Buwayhid dynasty, the Buyid dynasty, became the most powerful sultanate and effectively ruled the Muslim world, living in Baghdad. They lived in Baghdad during their pinnacle, and basically the Khalifa was essentially a type of token Khalifa, almost a hostage, to be honest. Now, the Buwayhids were 12er Shia, and it is because of the Buwayhids that 12er Shi'ism itself was codified. So 12er Shi'ism is one of the most dynamic strands of Islam. Dynamic here means what? It means it has a lot of spectrums. And the Buwayhids chose a particular, and they co-opted, and they chose particular theologians. So because of their efforts, 12er Shi'ism became codified. It became more popular than other strands of Shi'ism, and it became mainstream in the Muslim world. And Shi'ism became mainstream, 30-40%. We don't know how much, but a good percentage of Iraq and of Baghdad became 12er Shia under the Buwayhids. However, the Buwayhids were smart, and they didn't force Shi'ism on the population. But still, they were very public about it, and there were tensions, and there were riots in the city because the Shia were doing their things, the jalsas and whatnot, and the Hanabila were strong in Baghdad, as my previous library chats mentioned. And so the Khalifa was looking to get rid of the Buwayhids. The Khalifa did not want the Buwayhids. So the Khalifa was very happy when a new power came into the scene. This power was nominally Sunni. I say nominally because they weren't scholars, but they were regular Muslims, and so they were Sunni. And this is the first time this power, this superpower, had emerged. And this is the first Turkic superpower, and this is the Seljuqs. The Seljuqs, of course, are distant cousins of the later Ottomans. The Ottomans would come, and they're another tribe. The Seljuqs were one tribe of the Turkic tribes, and so the Seljuqs are on the rise. The Seljuqs are becoming dominant. They overthrew the Ghaznavids, and so the Khalifa in Baghdad wants the Seljuqs to come to Baghdad, and he wants the Seljuqs to overthrow the Buwayhids, and he's willing to give power over to the Seljuqs. Okay, so this is really important to understand. The Shia Buwayhid dynasty for 150 years has been dominant, and under their watch, Shi'ism has become fairly common, fairly popular, not the majority. If they had forced themselves on the Ummah, maybe a lot more people would be Shia, but they didn't force. But when you are in power, it's soft power. The publication of books, not the publication, but the sponsoring of authors, the rituals, the celebrations, and people convert organically or soft pressure or whatnot. And so the Sultan, or the Khalifa, wanted to get rid of the Buwayhids and bring in a new dynasty, and this is where the Seljuqs come into power. Now, our topic today is about intellectual history, not economic, not military, not political. My personal passion is intellectual history. However, as with all intellectual histories is always linked to all other types of history. So here's the point here. All of these different histories, political history, intellectual history, they all are interconnected and interwoven. Had it not been for the military might of the Seljuqs, along with the weakening economic power of the Buyas, which we're not getting into, and a host of other factors, the circumstances to bring a new theology into rise, i.e. Ash'arism, would not have arisen. And therefore, today's talk will discuss the rise of Ash'arism, but you need to understand political issues, economic issues, military issues all played a role because the Buwayhids were not able to defeat the Seljuqs. So the Seljuqs were able to come in, march into Baghdad, and overthrow the Buwayhid power base over there. I already discussed in the previous library chat the rise of Sunni Kalam, Ibn Furak, the first Ash'ari madrasa built in Nishapur. I already discussed Baghdad was a hardcore Hanbali capital. Hanbalism was dominant. All of the masajid that were Sunni, all of them were under the domain of the Hanbalites around 350 Hijrah. The Khalifa himself was sympathetic to Hanbali theology, and this is demonstrated in many things, most significantly the Qadri Creed. Read the Qadri Creed. It is available in English as well, somewhere online and whatnot. Read the Qadri Creed. It is but one example. It was officially recited for many decades from the minbar every single Friday. And the Qadiri Creed was anti-Shi'i. Why is this? Because that's the only thing they have left, right? The Buwayhids are in control, so they have this Qadiri Creed. And also, it was also anti-Mu'tazili, and it was also anti-Sunni Kalam. This is very clear from the Qadiri Creed. I had also mentioned, up until this point in time, that proto-Ash'arism and proto-Hanbalism or Salafism were not openly enemies of one another. Rather, there was a grudging tolerance but awkwardness between these two strands. Why? Because these two strands were organically coming from mainstream Sunnism. The rise of Sunni Kalam, which I have a whole lecture about, it came from within Sunnism. It wasn't from Mu'tazilism. And there were some minor tensions. Ibn Khuzaymah and his students, Ibn Hanbal and Muhasibi, Al-Barbahari and Ash'ari. By the way, once again, if you don't know any of this stuff, then you haven't listened to my previous chats or you've forgotten them. So please, once again, pause the video right here, look at the mark of whatever number we're on, the minute number, go back and listen to those library chats and come back and listen here, because again, I'm all going to continue from all of this. We discussed the mihna of the Ash'aris, the expulsion of Nishapur, Imam al-Harmain al-Juwayni, etc., the al-Kunduri and whatnot. Now, all of this is previous. We're going to begin now. After so many minutes is where actually our topic begins today. So let us begin. The Seljuqs come to power, and the Seljuqs are a warrior class. They are not administrators. So the Seljuqs ask around, and they ask the leading scholars of the town, who should they take in as a administrator, as a minister, to run the affairs of the country. The Seljuqs were warriors. They could not run a country. And this is where Al-Hasan ibn Ali ibn Ishaq al-Tusi, otherwise known as Nizam al-Mulk, comes into the picture. Nizam al-Mulk is the most famous minister, prime minister, administrator in the history of Islam. Even the average Muslim has vaguely heard of Nizam al-Mulk, even though they don't know most of the names of the Khulafa and most of the names of, but they know Nizam al-Mulk. And the rise of Ash'arism is directly linked to Nizam al-Mulk. One figure in all of human history, one figure is the primary cause of the rise of Ash'arism, and obviously the circumstances that he was given and he took advantage of. Now, Nizam al-Mulk grew up under the Ghaznavids, because again this is before the Seljuks came to power, and he turned to the scholarly route. He enrolled in the local madrasa, and it just so happened, just again one of those qadar Allah, it just so happens that the madrasa his father chose for him was one of the few Ash'ari madrasas of that region. Again, he's born in that Iran region where there were a few small pockets, as we said, of Ash'ari madrasas. Remember, there was no Ash'ari madrasa in Baghdad. Remember, the first Ash'ari madrasa, Ibn Furak, and then a few others popped up. Nizam al-Mulk is the one studying in one of those madrasas, and he studies Shafi'i fiqh and he studies Ash'ari theology. This study would have a profound impact on the rest of Islamic history, because this personal attachment would eventually be allowed to manifest itself at a national and then eventually at an international level, and quite literally change the course of history. His main teacher was someone by the name of Al-Muwaffaq Hibatullah. Al-Muwaffaq Hibatullah. And he writes about him in his autobiography that Al-Muwaffaq was one of the greatest of the sages of Khurasan, a blessed and respected man, and it is said that whoever studied with him would have a lot of fame and a lot of influence. So Nizam al-Mulk greatly loved Al-Muwaffaq and considered him to be one of the icons of the Ummah. Who is Al-Muwaffaq? Al-Muwaffaq is the grandson of one of the greatest Ash'ari scholars of the previous generation, and that is Abu Tayyib al-Su'luki. And Abu Tayyib al-Su'luki was one of the friends and the students and the colleagues of Abu Ishaq al-Isfara'ini. All of these are great Ash'ari scholars of the previous generation. So Nizam al-Mulk studies with Al-Muwaffaq. Eventually, Al-Muwaffaq's son Abu Sahl Muhammad becomes one of the main ulama and scholars of Ash'arism in Nishapur. And when Al-Kunduri launches the Mihna, again this is last library chat or 2 library chats ago, when Al-Kunduri launches the Mihna, I said he attacked 4 people by name, and he said these 4 need to be imprisoned. If they don't repent, they shall be executed. One of them was Al-Juwayni. He fled to Mecca and Medina. That's why he's called Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. And one of them was Abu Sahl Muhammad, the son of Muwaffaq and the friend of Nizam al-Mulk. Nizam al-Mulk and Abu Sahl grew up together, and they studied with the father Al-Muwaffaq, his father Al-Muwaffaq. And Abu Sahl was one of those who fled Nishapur when the arrest warrant was given, and he then brought a group of people who were sympathetic to him to literally fight against Kunduri. Again, I said this in the last lecture, go listen to that. So Al-Muwaffaq became a rebel against the previous administration, and Al-Muwaffaq literally came to the city again, wanting to free his fellow ulama, and was willing to go to actual fighting against the Sultan in order to get his friends out of jail. And this is the same person who is, of course, Nizam al-Mulk's friend. So Nizam al-Mulk is seeing all of this. Nizam al-Mulk didn't go down the scholarly route. He became an administrator. He became a minister. Nizam al-Mulk studied in a madrasa. He was educated. Remember, back in the day, what was studying? It was going through a madrasa. That's what studying was. So Nizam al-Mulk went through the same madrasa as Abu Sahl. However, he turned to administration. He turned to basically politics. And Nizam al-Mulk worked his way up the administration, initially working for the Ghaznavids, right? Seeing all that's happening with Kunduri. Then when the Seljuks come in and Al-Parsalan comes in, Al-Parsalan becomes the governor of Khurasan, and he makes Nizam al-Mulk his main vizier. This takes place in 450 Hijrah, 1059 CE. So Al-Parsalan, the Sultan of the Seljuks, he's a warrior. He's not a politician. Al-Parsalan doesn't know the basics of how to run a country. Nizam al-Mulk is the erudite, the scholar. He's the administrator. He's the diplomat. So Al-Parsalan gives Nizam al-Mulk carte blanche authority. basically Nizam al-Mulk is in charge of running the country. And as Alparslan grows in power, so too does Nizam al-Mulk. And eventually, when Alparslan becomes the Grand Sultan of the entire Seljuk Empire, when his uncle dies, Alparslan becomes the Sultan. In 455, Nizam al-Mulk becomes the Vizier of the entire empire. And he remains the Vizier from 455, which is 1064 CE, all the way to 485, which is 1092. So for around 30 years, Nizam al-Mulk had carte blanche authority of the Seljuk Empire. Now, the Seljuk Empire is now the primary empire of the Ummah, because the Khalifa invited the Seljuks to come into Baghdad and get rid of the Buwayhids. So this is where all of this is heading, right? And so you understand how we're setting up the stage over here for the rise of Nizam al-Mulk and the power of Nizam al-Mulk. Remember, Nizam al-Mulk is well aware of the traditionalist Ash'ari debate and divide. He has witnessed it firsthand from the persecution of Khurasan and al-Kunduri, and he was sympathetic to Abu Sahil, his friend, who was almost tortured in jail, and the other Ash'ari scholars. Within a year of Alparslan becoming the governor of Nishapur, right? Even before he is the vizier of the empire, within a year of Alparslan becoming the governor of Nishapur, Nizam al-Mulk establishes the very first of a series of prestigious madrasas, all of which would be called after himself the Nizamiya. And the concept of the madrasa, even though it wasn't new, I mean, we talked about the madrasa in previous lectures, and there were some madrasas here and there. Some of these madrasas concentrated on a legal madhab, others were dedicated to Quran, others were dedicated to hadith and whatnot. But by and large, madrasas were, generally speaking, one-man shows. One scholar would have one, madrasa. Through the Nizamiya, Nizam al-Mulk managed to revolutionize the entire educational system. And in fact, what he did had a profound impact on the concept of education. So much so that a number of historians posit the thesis that Nizam al-Mulk was the one who began the institution of universities as we know them. And the notion of studying for a number of years under many different scholars, an entire curriculum and syllabus, it seems as if Nizam al-Mulk was of the first. He wasn't the actual first person in human history, but no doubt he was one of the primary catalysts because of which the notion of universities spread. So Nizam al-Mulk started the Nizamiya in Nishapur. And what was different about the Nizamiya? A number of things. First and foremost, he now has the money of the government. Remember, previous madrasas, generally speaking, one or two were financed by a local, sultan or a local governor, I should say. But now we have basically the ruler himself, or the de facto ruler, and access to the wealth of the entire state. So the sheer scale of the college, the magnificence of the college. Also, Nizam al-Mulk was the first to start paying a stipend to the students to study there. And in all likelihood, we don't know 100%, but in all likelihood, you had to basically be qualified to study. You couldn't just walk in. So there's now, and again, we're assuming this from what we know because we don't have the details of these universities and colleges, but the fact that he would pay the students automatically indicates that for sure people would apply, to get in for no reason and whatnot, and some would not have been qualified to do so. So this is the first time the students are getting a stipend. Also, Nizam al-Mulk paid not just one alim or sheikh, but a group of ulama. The concept of multiple professors to teach different subjects. Before this point in time, if you wanted to become an alim, like Imam al-Bukhari, like Imam al-Shafi'i, like all of the great ulama, what did you have to do? You'd have to travel from place to place to place and study with one sheikh here, then one subject here, then one book there, and keep on going until you yourself amassed your own self-taught curriculum, if you like, right? So Nizam al-Mulk revolutionized this by bringing all of the professors to one place, all of the students to one place, and then standardizing the curriculum, and then building a network of similar institutions across several major cities. So the Nizamiya college wasn't just in Nishapur. We're gonna talk about it. It was actually a number of different cities, and the vizier personally oversaw and financed through state funds a number of Nizamiya colleges that were in Seljuk lands. The first Nizamiya was, of course, in his own land of Nishapur, and it opened in 450 Hijrah, and it was handed over to someone whom Nizam al-Mulk was very, very close close to, a mentor of, and Nizam al-Mulk studied with him once upon a time, and that is Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. As soon as Kundri was executed, Nizam al-Mulk comes to power. Nizam al-Mulk recalls Juwayni from being exiled, because remember, Juwayni fled for his life. That's why he's called Imam al-Haramain. He was in Mecca and Medina. So Nizam al-Mulk calls him back and hands over the keys of the Nizamiya to Al-Juwayni. So Al-Juwayni gets charge of this massive, beautiful building with as much finances as he wants, and he basically is told, "Khalas, tafaddal, this is yours to teach as you wish." Additionally, Al-Juwayni became the Khatib and the Imam of the Grand Mosque of Nishapur, which is called the Mani'i Masjid, the largest masjid of Nishapur. Remember, hitherto, the Ash'ari didn't have this place, right? They did have a madrasa. They might have had one or two masajid, but the Karramiyya were in charge under the Ghaznavis. Remember this point. The Ash'ari did not have any major masjid, and they definitely didn't have a massive university or college. Now this is all going to change, and Nizam al-Mulk is still the vizier of a governor. We're going back 450. Al-Parsalan hasn't yet become the sultan, the grand sultan. Al-Parsalan is the governor. When Al-Parsalan is the governor, Nizam al-Mulk already starts this process, and he builds the first Nizamiya. Now, when Al-Parsalan becomes the grand sultan, right? Now Nizam al-Mulk has access to much more than Nishapur, and he has access to funds much more than just what was previously. And so he begins to build a series of madrasas, the second one of which was, and this is the key point here, brothers and sisters, if you're still with me, because again, all of this is nerdy, geeky stuff, and I keep on saying, why would anybody be interested in this type of stuff except people like me and whatnot? But alhamdulillah, it seems like people really are interested. I get comments and whatnot, and so alhamdulillah, good for you guys. Anyway, what was I saying? So the second Nizamiya that was built was in Baghdad. This is where the tables are going to turn. The second Nizamiya, its construction begins 1 year or 2 years after Al-Parsalan marches into Baghdad and overthrows the Buwayhids. In the year 457, the Nizamiya of Baghdad begins construction, and in the year 459 Hijrah, corresponding to 1067, the inauguration is going to take place. This Nizamiya of Baghdad can be considered to be the first proto-university in the Sunni Arab world. I want you to understand this point. There were proto-universities before this. Al-Azhar predates the Nizamiya, but Al-Azhar was what type of institution? It was a Fatimid, Ismaili, Shi'i institution. So that type of notion did exist, but it was only one university in Al-Azhar over there. There were other small, batches here and there that had somewhat similar programs, but none of them were as grandiose as the Nizamiya in scope, in size, in student body. And so, and none of them were mainstream Sunni up until this point in time. So the Nizamiya in Baghdad can be considered to be the first proto-university in the Arab world. So we have the Nizamiya of Nishapur, which is Iranian, of course Nishapur is in Iran, the Nizamiya of Baghdad, and then within the next 5 years, 7 years, Nizam al-Mulk opens up another Nizamiya in Balkh, Nizamiya in Herat, Nizamiya in Isfahan, Nizamiya in Basra, Nizamiya in Maru, Nizamiya in Amul, Nizamiya in Mosul, and maybe more than this. At least 9, maybe even 11 Nizamiyas were built across the Muslim world. And as I said, Nizam al-Mulk also instituted a very unique custom, which was unheard of, that he would pay the students an amount of stipend as well. Forget student debt. Students would get money to finance their studies, and the professors were well taken care of. Previously, smaller madrasas many times lacked the endowments to provide even the teachers with reasonable salaries, much less the students. Students never got a stipend, and many of them had to resort to other jobs or whatnot. So all of this resulted in a very difficult study for the students pre-Nizamiya. To study would be difficult. What would happen after you study? Financially, their future. Now, what's going to happen here is that the institution of the statewide madrasa radically changed all of that. Students were taken care of. They could study in peace. After graduation, if they excelled, they could become professors in Nizamiyas around the Muslim world, or find other places where they could teach. And being a graduate of the Nizamiya earned them a lot of respect. The Nizamiya were the Ivy Leagues of the Muslim world. This is the best universities, the best colleges, and Nizam al-Mulk had all of this in mind. Thus, the entire enterprise of scholarship is taken to a whole different level. And with the Nizamiya, the dominance of the Shafi'i school in places where it never reached before, and more importantly for our case, the dominance of Ash'ari theology begins. So Nizam al-Mulk seeks to harness the potential of the power that can be wielded through the ulama and the impact of ulama upon the masses. As I said, Nizam al-Mulk personally oversaw. He took an active role. He didn't just delegate. He chose who the professors would be, and he had ultimate authority and full control over all of the professorships. And it is clear from our historical understanding that the project of the Nizamiya had little to do with the actual Seljuk Sultan. The Seljuk Sultan really didn't take any active role. It is something that Nizam al-Mulk himself very much wanted to do. Now, the fact that Nizam al-Mulk was finally able to establish a Nizamiya in the center of Arab lands, in the capital of the Muslim world, it was a feat in and of itself. However, the mere construction and operation of the institute would not be enough to spread Ash'ari theology. There would have to be a struggle, and this struggle would be manifested in a number of different incidents, some of which we will discuss today. So the inauguration of the Nizamiya. The inauguration of the Nizamiya took place on the day of Eid al-Adha, the 10th of Dhul Hijjah in the year 459 Hijrah, corresponding to the 22nd of September 1067 CE. And the noblemen of the city were invited, and a great ceremony was going to take place. Nizam al-Mulk himself did not attend. He was in Nishapur. However, Nizam al-Mulk had given very clear authority, very clear instructions that Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi would be handed over the professorial chair, the main institute. He would be the governor of the school, not the governor, what do you call it, the dean of the school, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi. This was very clear that Abu Ishaq was supposed to take over the professorial chair. For reasons that we are not 100% certain about, Abu Ishaq did not show up in ambiguous circumstances. Something happened to prevent him from coming there. And a very powerful businessman with a lot of wealth and a lot of connections and a powerful supporter of the Hanbali faction of Baghdad, Abu Mansur ibn Yusuf, was the one who got the job of Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi. So there seems to have been an internal coup, and you have somebody else being given the job. Long story short, when Nizam al-Mulk found out, he reacted with anger, and he immediately wrote a letter reprimanding the people in charge that how could they have allowed this to take place, and he penalized the people that were there monetarily. He fined them. How dare you allow this person to be given this position? And after 20 days of being in charge, Ibn al-Sabah was asked to leave, and Nizam al-Mulk forced Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi to become the professorial chair, meaning by, of course he wanted it, I'm saying, got rid of the other people. Now, in his letter that he wrote, which is preserved in a number of early books, including Al-Muntazam ibn al-Jawzi, Nizam al-Mulk writes, who else did I found this college for except for Abu Ishaq? Who else was supposed to be, the one in charge except for Abu Ishaq? Now, this incident already begins to show Nizam al-Mulk is playing a very, very active role. It's not just to show that I want a beautiful university under my name. No, he wants specific people, and he's angry, he's irritated that another person is being given this position and not Abu Ishaq. Abu Ishaq, who was he? Abu Ishaq was a Shafi'i scholar who was also an Ash'ari alim. The other person that was assigned the post, Ibn al-Sabbagh, he was pro-Hanbali in Aqidah. He wasn't Ash'ari in Aqidah. And the fact that Nizam al-Mulk takes an active role, gets rid of this guy, puts this guy in, is the first of many incidents that shows that one of the primary purposes, and again, I'm not saying this to diminish or disparage, just look at the historical text. That's all I'm saying. I know it comes across as if I'm trying to be conspiratorial. No, read the books, it is very clear. And honestly, if that's what he believed to be the truth, which clearly he did, why wouldn't he do that? I mean, it's what any person of that mindset would do. If you are sectarian minded, and there's nothing wrong that time frame, everybody was sectarian minded. It was what it was, the Hanabila were and the Ash'aris were. And the fact that Nizam al-Mulk is Ash'ari, he wants his people in charge and he wants his group there. It's understandable. And so he insists that Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, and by the way, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi has a book that is printed. You can buy this online. Al-Ishara ila madhhabi ahli al-haqq, allusion to the people of the truth. And in this, he clearly is very clear that he's an Ash'ari. He talks about the sifat in the Ash'ari manner. So clearly this person is an Ash'ari theologian, and Nizam al-Mulk is enamored with him. He wants him to become the professorial chair. Now, after the Nizamiya opened, so within the college, therefore, the Nizamiya, and another key point here, by the way, the Nizamiya college had a plaque outside of it. It had a sign outside of it. And that sign literally said, the Ash'ari Nizamiya College. This is a very key point which we're going to come back to as well. The Ash'ari Nizamiya College. Not the Shafi'i, the Ash'ari Nizamiya College. Again, it's very clear that this college, this university is meant to be, even though it was Shafi'i as well, by the way. It only taught the Shafi'i madhab. It did not teach the other madhabs at the time. And because there were other madrasas, yani local, as we said, to teach their own schools and whatnot, Nizam al-Mulk was a Shafi'i and he was an Ash'ari. And he wanted his Nizamiya to preach that version of, or that strand of Islam. So Nizam al-Mulk, therefore, as we said, instituted the Nizamiya of Baghdad, and for a number of years it was teaching with minimal incident. However, it appeared that a clash was bound to occur, and that is because the Hanabila were grumbling. The Hanbalis of Baghdad were not happy that a new strand had come in, and an incident occurred during this time frame under Nizam al-Mulk's watch. An incident occurred that would be the first time where the Hanbalis and the Ash'aris literally split up, and this split would be permanent. It would keep the ummah divided in these two factions up until our times. And this split, this fitna, is called the fitna of Al-Qushayri. The fitna of Al-Qushayri. This fitna is extremely significant, and it marks the actual beginning of the physical demarcation. Up until this point in time, these two strands are grumbling, tolerating one another. Up until this point in time, these two strands might not like each other, some amongst them, but there's never been an outright you guys are evil and you guys are mubtadi' and you guys say this about Allah Azza wa Jalla. It's like they're not seeing eye to eye, but they're kind of tolerating. The fitna of Al-Qushayri is what began the division. Now, what is the fitna of Al-Qushayri? That's what we're going to talk about in this next section. And by the way, today's lecture will be quite long. I don't know how long it's going to be. You can take a look at the time beneath you. And I'll probably take a few breaks and come back, because I just want to get this done with and then come back. I don't want to do another library chat and go back and forth. We've done, mashallah, tabarakallah, more than enough on this topic. I want to move on to other topics. Now, what is the fitna of Al-Qushayri? The fitna of Al-Qushayri is what happened when one of the firebrand Ash'ari clerics was chosen for the explicit purposes of preaching Ash'arism to the masses. Now, what happened was that Nizam al-Mulk was able to now co-opt, after 10 years of teaching within the seminary, within the Nizamiya of Baghdad. Finally, there was enough public support, enough people there to open up a professorial chair, a halaqa, in one of the main masjids of Baghdad. Notice here, understand this point. Up until this point in time, 460 Hijrah, up until this point in time, right? The Ash'aris did not publicly teach Ash'arism in Baghdad. They had no public chair. The first time it was taught in a madrasa setting was the Nizamiya. Yes, there were a few private, Ash'aris obviously, and they might have had, private students. For example, Al-Baqillani was in Baghdad, right? And others, one or two here and there. But as a madrasa, as a professorial chair, that did not exist. Now, for the first time, Nizam al-Mulk is able to co-opt a major chair in one of the masajid. Up until this point, for the previous 200 years, 180 years, whatever, only the Hanabila have taught in those chairs. Only proto-Atharis or Salafis, whatever you call them, have taught in those chairs. And now Nizam al-Mulk has co-opted one of the main professorial chairs and one of the main masajid of Baghdad. And the chair was meant to teach Aqidah. It was meant to teach Aqidah. And who was chosen for this? The famous Al-Qushayri, who died 514 Hijrah, corresponding to 1120 CE. Pause here, footnote. This Al-Qushayri was the grandson of the famous Sufi / Ash'ari Qushayri who wrote Risala al-Qushayriya. So Risala al-Qushayriya, very famous, Qushayri was his grandfather. This is the grandson. The grandson, the younger Al-Qushayri, studied under Ibn Furak. He was one of the main students of Al-Juwayni. He was one of the main students of Abu Ishaq al-Isfaraini. These are all major Ash'ari ulama. And now this young man, barely 30 years old, a firebrand, because generally speaking, when you're in your 20s and 30s, that's when you're fiery and rain and brimstones and whatnot. Everybody's deviant and whatnot. So this is the Qushayri, the young Qushayri. By all accounts, he was hardcore firebrand. And like all Ash'ari ulama, pretty much, born and raised in Nishapur, coming from the Iranian madrasas of Ash'arism. So, Nizam al-Mulk sends Al-Qushayri from Nishapur to Baghdad around 469 Hijrah and tells him, you're in charge of this chair. Remember, Nizam al-Mulk is the vizier. He has the political clout to give that chair to Al-Qushayri. So Al-Qushayri marches into the city and within a short period of time publicly begins lambasting the Hanabila, preaching Ash'ari theology in a very, very provocative manner, publicly saying that the Hanabila are Hashawiyya and Mujassima and other such terms that every student of knowledge knows. And the news spread quickly in the city that Al-Qushayri and that masjid is making fun of all of us and saying all of these terms. And so the leading Hanbali of the city, a very learned and hardline cleric and a very elderly cleric, maybe triple the age of Al-Qushayri, Al-Sharif Abu Jafar. Al-Sharif Abu Jafar was the one who actually had a mihna of Ibn Aqil and whatnot. So again, go look, maybe another library chat about that. Al-Sharif Abu Jafar is like the mufti of the Hanabila. He's like literally the inheritor of somebody like Al-Barbahari. He is the new Imam Ahmad. So he's the main Hanbali scholar, well known, everybody knows him, Al-Sharif Abu Ja'far. Al-Sharif Abu Ja'far hears of this, and Al-Sharif Abu Ja'far riles up the masses and said, how can this be happening? How can this be happening in our own city? How can this deviant come and call us deviants themselves? He himself is a deviant. So his students start riling up, Qushayri's students start riling up, and the murmurs of the city, the tensions start to rise, and the rector of the Nizamiya, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, sensing that this Al-Qushayri is a firebrand, he's igniting the public, he writes to Nizam al-Mulk begging for help, like, what do I do? This is really causing a lot of fitna in the city, and it's only a matter of time before something happens. Well, something indeed did happen. The sources that we have, a number of sources, all of them, they say the same thing, that Al-Qushayri students marched to the masjid of Abu Ja'far, where Abu Ja'far was preaching, and began saying things out in public outside the masjid, and Abu Ja'far's students lost their cool and began pelting them with stones and with clay bricks. When this happened, the two student bodies broke out into a brawl in public. Fighting broke out between bearded Butawwas and bearded students of knowledge and Tullab al-Ilm, on the one hand students of Al-Qushayri, i.e. Ash'aris, on the other hand students of Abu Ja'far, i.e. Hanbalis or Salafis. And these are all students of these clergymen. And so they began fighting one another. And in this fight, they're throwing things and people's shoes and bricks and whatever they have with each other. In this fight and melee which take place in the bazaar outside of the masjid, an innocent bystander is killed and many of the shops are damaged. And the Hanabila are larger in number because this is their city, and the Qushayri students, for whatever reason, they were thinking they marched into their quarters, right? Because the Nizamiya was in one side of the city, and as is gonna happen, slowly but surely that side becomes more and more Ash'ari. It's human nature, it's gonna happen. And Sharif wa Ja'far on the other side, which is the majority, the heart of the city, and for whatever reason, Qushayri students marched into that side of the city. They probably weren't thinking a fight would break out, but again, that's what's going to happen when you have bunches of overzealous fanatics on both sides. And I have to say this, both sides are fanatical. This is the reality of fanaticism. Can you imagine the bystanders? Can you imagine the 99% of the innocent people of Baghdad? What are they fighting over? Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa. What is the literal physical fighting? What does it mean that Allah is fawqa as-sama? I mean, these are literally, so this is the first time in human history, in Islamic history, that the Salafis and the Ash'aris had their had their warfare. All of the online stuff that you see, this is basically coming from the first time that this occurred over here in the year 469. So the students of Al-Qushayri, we're still back in the melee, back in the bazaar, right? The students of Al-Qushayri, they run back to the other side and they lock themselves in the Nizamiya. And the students of Abu Jafar, they rile up the other people, not the masses, the other students, and they surround the Nizamiya. Can you believe the Nizamiya is under siege right now? You have the Hanabila, the Salafis on the outside. I call them Salafis because people understand they didn't call themselves Salafis. This is the Hanabila. They call themselves Sunnis and Hanbalis, right? So they're outside the city. The Nizamiya is locked, and the students have taken retreat, and they're under their fortress and whatnot. And now, to mock the Khalifa, they start calling out from the Nizamiya college that they call out to the Khalifa in Egypt, al-Mustansir billah, and they say, Ya Mustansir billah, help us against these people who are oppressing us. Now, what is going on here? The Abbasid Khalifa, his name was Al-Muqtadi. The Abbasid Khalifa is literally a few feet away. Well, not a few feet away, but within a mile or two. The Abbasid Khalifa is in Baghdad, and he's right there. And the Nizamiya students began shouting to the Fatimid Khalifa in Cairo, saying, hey, who's going to help us? Can you help us? Why? Because the Abbasid Khalifa was pro-Hanbali. The Abbasid Khalifa would not side with the Nizamiya students against the Hanabila, and that's his own main power base. Remember, the Seljuqs are not physically in Baghdad. They were smart people. The Seljuqs and Nizam al-Mulk is in Iran. He is in Nishapur. And in Baghdad, you have the representatives, you have the people, but the actual Khalifa and the people in charge of the city who are living there and whatnot, they are pro-Hanbali. Now, pause here, footnote. When I say pro-Hanbali, I'm not implying that the Khalifa was a religious person who believed in Hanbalism. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But without a doubt, he understood his power base. Without a doubt, he knew that this is the people that support me and I need to take care of them, right? And so the Nizamiya students know that the Khalifa is not going to support them. So the students of Abu Jafar, camped around outside. Eventually they calm down and they retreat, and no further fighting takes place. The rector of the university, Abu Ishaq, whom I already mentioned, Abu Ishaq became very angry, and he announced his intention to directly go to Nishapur himself and to explain to Nizam al-Mulk what had happened. And so Abu Ishaq packs his bag. He wants to go to Nishapur. The Khalifa in Baghdad hears, and the Khalifa says, no, you cannot go. You are under not arrest, but you're banned from travel. You have a visa ban on you. Why? Because the Khalifa, you guys have to understand this, so much knowledge, so much background and knowledge, information has to be given. I apologize if I'm helter-skelter, but there's so much information to be summarized here. Guys, the Khalifa is not powerful. The Khalifa is not powerful. Imagine the Queen of England, right? She needs, or he needs, the help of the people around him. And the people in charge are actually the Seljuqs. The Khalifa is going to be embarrassed if somebody goes and explains that under his watch, in his city, a fight broke out against the Hanabila and against the Ash'ari. He's really embarrassed at what happened. He doesn't want Abu Ishaq to go to Nizam al-Mulk. So the Khalifa stops Abu Ishaq from traveling to Nishapur. Nonetheless, Abu Ishaq sends one of the students with a letter, and Abu Ishaq's student goes to Nizam al-Mulk and updates him exactly what happened. And his reply comes back expressing anger that the Hanabila had overpowered his students and had done what they had done. And the letter stated, and we have the letter preserved in the books of history, Nizam al-Mulk says, I see that we should desist, stop in speaking about the school that I have built. We should almost cancel the school. Like, he's so angry and frustrated. So the Khalifa now, of course, in Baghdad, he feared that Abu Ishaq and the Nizami students would paint a very negative picture of him in front of the Seljuk Sultan. And so the Khalifa calls a meeting in his palace in Baghdad. The Khalifa calls a meeting. This is groundbreaking. This is an attempt to carve out a truce, a peace between who? Between the Ash'aris and the Salafis, between Ash'aris and the Hanabila. The Khalifa calls a meeting in his palace, and he invites Abu Jafar, the Hanbali Shaykh al-Islam, or the Hanbali Mufti of the time, and he invites Ash-Shirazi, the rector of the university, and he invites Al-Qushayri, and he invites very few key people, and he invites them to the palace, and he tries to solve the problem. This is a historic meeting. It is indicating that tensions have gone to an all new level. And the Khalifa, so another point you guys should be aware of, subhanAllah, really bizarre things here. The Khalifa, for many centuries, and that's why the Abbasids were different from the Umayyads. The Umayyad Khulafa, and again, a lot of negative things, I'm not praising them for this, but it is what it is. The Umayyad Khulafa would interact with the people, they would talk directly to the people, and they would speak directly to the people. The Abbasid Khulafa, especially in this time frame, they stopped interacting directly with the people, and they kept a barrier between them and the people. Even when they came to visit, there were people who would communicate. You would not even see the Khalifa sometimes. Like, you would literally go through a third party, a minister, whatnot. I mean, they were called hajibs at the time. So you have this intermediary person. So you go to the intermediary goes back to the Khalifa, comes back to you, and then tells you. So these people who came to the palace, they weren't sitting in front of the Khalifa. The Khalifa was in his room, and there's a person going back and forth, to try to solve this issue between them. So we have eyewitness accounts of what happened here. When Abu Jafar came, the Shaykh al-Hanabila, Ash-Shirazi stood up and he kissed the head of Abu Jafar, and he said to him that, oh Shaykh, you are my Shaykh, I love you, because Abu Jafar was very old, like 80 years old, like very old person, right? So he goes, you are my Shaykh, I study with you, because Abu Ishaq is from Baghdad, he's been there for a while, he knows for many years. He goes, and I am who I am. And Abu Ja'far said that all that you say is true, but your true colors have come out. When you were alone, without the Nizamiya, without this, you showed that you were one of us. But now when you have these people, and when Nizam al-Mulk, he called them Khawaja Buzurg. Khawaja Buzurg was the title of Nizam al-Mulk. When Khawaja Buzurg came to you with all of his help and whatnot, you showed your true colors and you manifested who you really were. You're a chameleon. When you didn't have Nizam al-Mulk, you pretended, he said, you were Hanbali, right? When Khawaja Buzurg give you all of this power and the whatnot, you showed who you are. So get away from me. I don't want anything to do with you. So he refused to allow Abu Ishaq to show him any respect. Then another person stood up, a young man. He stood up. Abu Ja'far said, who are you? And he said, I am Al-Qushayri. I am, the firebrand cleric, because Abu Ja'far had never met Al-Qushayri. This is the first time they're meeting. So he said, if anybody should be thanked for his bid'ah, it should be this man. Because this man has not been a hypocrite. He has shown us what is inside of himself, and he has manifested what he believes, unlike the other people in the room who did not support me. So what's going on here? He is irritated at all of the ulama who were silent and what's happening. He's irritated that the Nizamiya has been allowed to be produced or formed. He's irritated that the professorial chair of the Ash'aris is allowed to teach, and all of what he thought were his crew are silent at this. So he goes, all of you are hypocrites. All of you are doing this. You should have stopped this. as for this kid, Al-Qushayri, because he's a young man, Al-Qushayri, the least we can say, we thank him that he's speaking what he believes. He's not double-faced like all of you guys. So the point is that, obviously he doesn't like Al-Qushayri. The point is that he's irritated at the senior clergy of the city who sat back and tacitly allowed, or who actively participated, like Abu Ishaq, in this regard. So the vizier tries to calm him down. The vizier in Baghdad, because there's a vizier of Nizam al-Mulk, there's a vizier in Baghdad. The vizier tries to calm him down. The vizier says, let's try to have sulh. And the senior Hanbali scholar says, Abu Jafar says, how can we have sulh between us two? Sulh can take place when people are arguing over positions, over money, over inheritance, over kingdom. As for these people, the Asha'ira, they think we are kuffar, and we too consider those who oppose our beliefs to be kuffar. So how can there be reconciliation between us two? And then he raised his voice, Abu Ja'far, the Khalifa sitting in the next room, not in front. He raises his voice and he says, and here is our Imam, the Khalifa, harassing us Muslims, us, the Hanabila, even though his own grandfather, Al-Qa'im and Al-Qadir, commanded that their Aqidah be read to the masses, to read to the Muslims, and it was required to read, and the people read this Aqidah. Remember the Aqidah we talked about, the Qadri Creed? The Qadri Creed was read across the globe, including in Khurasan. Why did he mention Khurasan? Because the Ash'aris are from Khurasan. So as for us, we are still upon the beliefs of the grandfather of the Khalifa. So this was a very sly, or not a sly, it's a very harsh punch, if you like, to the gut of the Khalifa. Like, look at you. Again, I mean, he's saying, your own grandfathers upon this Aqidah, we're upon this Aqidah. These are the new people in the room. Why are they allowed to come here? So the vizier tried his best to do whatever, calm them down. There was no calming down. And so the Khalifa decided that Abu Ja'far, the grand mufti of the Hanabila, the Shaykh al-Islam of the Hanabila, that Abu Ja'far should be a permanent guest in one of the rooms of his palace, i.e. imprisoned, never to leave. He may have some visitors, but no teaching. And so Abu Ja'far remained there under palace house arrest until he fell very sick, and then he was handed over to his family and he passed away shortly after this. Now, why did Abu Ja'far, why was he arrested? Because the Khalifa could not arrest Al-Qushayri. Al-Qushayri is the guest of Nizam al-Mulk. He is sent by Nizam al-Mulk. And two of these people are inciting the masses. They've had an actual brawl, an actual fist fight. A person has died. And the Khalifa has to quell this. He cannot put any restrictions on Nizam al-Mulk's entourage, including Al-Qushayri. But he does have control over the Hanabila. And so, what does he do? He imprisons, again, not in prison, but in the palace. He imprisons Abu Ja'far and he says, Khalas, you will be my guest from now on. And the point being that he could not rile up the masses. And so the point here is very clear here that Sharif Abu Ja'far was eventually, by the way, eventually he was denied visitors, by the way. When people would send his letters outside, eventually even visitors were stopped coming, until finally he fell sick a few months after this. And when he fell very sick, the Khalifa became very concerned and he sent him back to his family, and within a few days he died. And even then rumors persisted that the Asha'ira had murdered Sharif Abu Ja'far. This is the rumors, the legends at the time. This is the conspiracy. Everybody loves to do this to this day. Now, a letter was now sent to Nizam al-Mulk from Abu Shiraz, saying that, from Abu Ishaq, saying that perhaps it is best that Al-Qushayri goes back to Nishapur. Perhaps it is best that Al-Qushayri stop being in Baghdad. And so Nizam al-Mulk recalled Al-Qushayri from Baghdad to Nishapur, and Al-Qushayri returned to Nishapur, never to return to Baghdad until he passed away. Okay, so I'm going to take a short break here and then inshallah come back for round 2. Bismillah.
تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. So we had discussed the fitna of Al-Qushayri and the fact that this was the first time that a physical altercation occurred between the Hanabila and the Ash'ira, and the Khalifa got involved, and Nizam al-Mulk got involved. So this is now a problem between these two strands that is at the highest political levels, and Nizam al-Mulk is sympathetic to the Ash'aris, the Khalifa is sympathetic to the Hanabila, and the Khalifa basically house arrests the leader of the Hanabila, and either him directly or indirectly through the rector of the Nizamiya. I forgot to mention this, that it appears that the Khalifa was the one who suggested to the rector of the Nizamiya to write to Nizam al-Mulk and to bring Qushayri back to Nishapur. The point was that they wanted to quell whom they thought would be the leaders of the trial between the two factions. So, with both of the leaders of the parties out of sight, it was felt that the fitna of Baghdad had come to an end. Unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. And it appears that the way both of the leaders had been treated, the one under house arrest and the other basically expelled and returned back to Nishapur, continued to provoke the students on both sides of this theological divide. And grumblings and back and forths took place until finally things reached another critical level, and this occurred in Ramadan of the following year. In the Ramadan of the year 470 Hijrah, which corresponds to March 1078, once again the rector of the university, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, wrote to Nizam al-Mulk saying that we have an impasse here, and what should I do regarding the issue of the Hanabila, quote unquote, like this is getting out of hand, what should I do with regards to the issue of the Hanabila? It appears that this was the final straw for Nizam al-Mulk, and he wrote back a very, very harsh letter to Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, and the entire letter is preserved in the books of history, and for our purposes we need to translate certain portions, because really this letter again, guys, understand, this is a letter from Nizam al-Mulk in Nishapur to the rector of the Nizamiya in Baghdad, and the entire letter is preserved, and you can look this up in Ibn al-Jawzi's history book Al-Muntazam. You can look it up over there, and a portion of this letter I've translated and I'm going to read to you. So this is directly from Nizam al-Mulk. I began the translation. Quote, "Your letter came to us in a manner that was clearly more verbose than necessary. You wrote more than you needed to. It is not in the best interest of the Sultan," meaning the Sultan of the Seljuks, Al-Parsalan, "that he adopt a policy which favors one school over another. And it is more befitting that we support the Sunnah rather than exacerbate tension. And we did not intend anything through the building of this madrasa, of this university, except to protect the people of knowledge and to benefit the people. We did not build it to cause disunity or to split ranks. And whenever matters go contrary to what we intended from these means, there is no choice left except to shut this door. And it is not in our power, لَيْسَ فِي قُدْرَتِنَا, it is not in our power to tackle Baghdad and its surrounding cities, or to convert them from what they have been accustomed to. For what is predominant in that region is the madhab of Imam Abu Abdullah Ahmad ibn Hanbal rahimahullah ta'ala, and his maqam is well known amongst the scholars, and his rank is famous in defending the Sunnah. What has reached us is that this matter has once again resurfaced," meaning what happened with the Hanabila and the Ash'ari has come back again, "because of a question that Al-Qushayri responded to regarding the usul of this religion, and the response he gave was something different from what they believed in their aqidah." The Shaykh, the Imam Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, he's writing to the rector here, right, is a man who has a good heart but is easy to lead, and he follows any who tries to pull him. And we have in our received correspondence from him that which clearly shows the ease by which he is pulled, and it goes on, and he wants to get rid of Abu Ishaq as the rector. Now, the significance of this letter cannot be overstated. Nizam al-Mulk basically, explicitly states that the attempt to change the aqidah of the people from what they were accustomed to, Hanbalism, to what he wanted, Ash'arism, is impossible. And because it's causing so much fitna, then this needs to be abandoned. And he lays the primary blame on the rector of the university, Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi, whom he says is of weak resolve. He's a good guy, but he's not a leader. And presumably, if Shirazi had taken a stronger leadership, then all of this would not have happened. And this letter quickly spilled into the streets. The news of it became common amongst the people, and the Hanabila saw it as a victory for them, because the letter says we're not going to continue along this line, and presumably this would have caused, bragging and whatnot, which of course led to a reaction from the Ash'aris. Okay, so after the letter became common knowledge, in the 2nd of Shawwal, the day after Eid, literally the day after Eid, in the year 470 Hijrah, a student of the Nizamiya by the name of Al-Iskandarani began speaking loudly in the bazaar, in the marketplace, against the Hanabila, claiming that the Hanabila's aqidah necessitated kufr. Okay, immediately, and he was surrounded by some of the students of the Nizamiya. Immediately, he was hit by a brick from an unknown assailant. He returned to the Nizamiya and he beseeched the Nizamiya students for help. After all that had occurred in the last 10 months, the students had had enough, as had the Hanabila of Baghdad, and so a complete riot, an intentional melee or riot broke out in the marketplace, and complete chaos ensued. Weapons were brought from houses. Both of these students came and fought one another with swords, with weapons, and over a dozen people were killed, including a sick student who was recovering in one of the rooms of the Nizamiya. The people had to rush for the Khalifa's diwan for help and call in the army to quell the mob. Brothers and sisters, the fitna between the Hanabila and the Ash'ari reached such a despicable low that students, madrasa students of Abu Jafar, who's already passed away, and Al-Qushayri, who's now back in Naishapur, they are fomenting this hatred, and they are literally killing one another. Over a dozen students of knowledge were killed between the fight between the Hanabila and the Ash'ari. Now people come and say to me, why are you using such calm language? Why are you? Ya akhi, learn from history of what use was this bloodshed, of what fa'idah was bringing righteous people of both sides, accusing takfir and tabdi'. What was the benefit of it all? Thus ended the fitna between the Hanabila and Ash'ari in a physical sense, but even though the physical door was closed, and I am not aware of an actual physical battle taking place in which a dozen people or more were killed ever since that time. However, the door of intellectual debate and harshness and tabdi' was flung wide open, and this marked the beginning of a continuous battle that still lasts from the fanatics of both sides against one another, of tabdi' and of ilzam of kufr. And if you say X, it implies Y, and Y is kufr, therefore X is also kufr. A'udhu billah, the same back and forth has taken place. In any case, this is the famous fitna of Al-Qushayri, which has two parts. Part 1, Qushayri himself was involved, and Al-Sharif Abu Jafar himself was involved. So you had both of them. So the both of them were gotten rid of. And in fact, rather than make things better, it made things worse, because now they didn't have a leadership to keep them in a little bit in check. And so these two students from the Nizamiya and from the students of Al-Sharif Abu Ja'far, they had a full out battle in the main bazaar of Baghdad, and over a dozen of their students were killed. And this caused such a backlash that both sides retreated physically, but then the intellectual, as we said, and the verbal battles remained open. And this wasn't the last. There were a few minor skirmishes occurred that continued to occur, and one minor skirmish that was recorded in the books of history was in the time of Ibn al-Jawzi. He records this in the year 538, and another issue happened here and there until finally the Hanabila of Baghdad, they petitioned the Khalifa of the time to remove the term Ash'ari that had been placed outside the Nizamiya college, and to call it the Nizamiya college, not the Ash'ari Nizamiya college. So the Khalifa commanded that the term Ash'ari be removed from the Nizamiya college, and so 80 years after it had opened up, the term Ash'ari was removed and it was called the Nizamiya college. And this clearly shows, as I said by the way, that one of the main goals and focuses of the college was to spread Ash'arism. And what happened with the fitna and the letter of Nizam al-Mulk and the entire clash between the Hanabila and between the students of Al-Sharif and the students of Al-Qushayri clearly shows all of this reality. Now the Abu Ishaq al-Shirazi passed away, and after him a number natural death. He didn't die in the fight, and after him a number of successors came back and forth until finally Nizam al-Mulk asked Juwayni to tell him who would he recommend to be the biggest and brightest mind to send to Baghdad? Who does al-Juwayni recommend to become the next rector after all of this fitna had occurred? Now he wants somebody wiser, more diplomatic, and erudite to take charge of the university. And so al-Juwayni suggests somebody whom every single Muslim is familiar with up until this time, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was handed over the rectorship and the presidency and the professorial chair of the most famous institute in the Islamic world, the Nizamiya of Baghdad. The Nizamiya of Baghdad being the most famous because it is in Baghdad, more famous than the Nizamiya of Nishapur. And he was also handed the professorial chair of the madrasa and the masjid next to it that Al-Qushayri had occupied. And with Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a new chapter of Ash'arism begins, a chapter that has been discussed and analyzed numerous times, and therefore we can leave it off from here. Now, the primary thesis of what we've done, and we're going to move on, we're not done yet, but to summarize here, the primary thesis that I am positing, and I'm not the only one to do this, is that the institution of the Nizamiya was the main catalyst for the spread of Ash'ari thought and for the eventual dominance of Ash'ari thought. Now, I'm not the first person, and I'm not the only person to derive this thesis. In fact, every historian of Islam, even outsiders who have studied Islam from a perspective where they don't care about which of these two factions is more powerful or whatnot, they have reached the same conclusion. Of the earliest or the most famous is the Hungarian professor of Islamic studies, Ignaz Goldziher, who wrote over 120 years ago, and I quote from his book, he wrote, and I quote directly from his book, "For a long time it was not possible for the Ash'arites to teach theology in public. It was not until the middle of the 11th century when the vizier of the Seljuqs, Nizam al-Mulk, created public chairs in the great schools founded by him in Nishapur and in Baghdad for the new theological doctrine that Ash'ari dogmatic theology could be taught officially. And it was admitted into the system of orthodox theology. Its most illustrious representatives could have chairs in the Nizamiya institutions. It is then here that the victory," listen to this is Goldziher, "it is here that the victory of the Ash'ari school was decided in its struggle against Mu'tazilism on the one hand and intransigent orthodoxy, viz. Hanbali traditionalism, on the other. In the era in which these institutions flourished, is therefore important not only in the history of education but also that of Muslim dogmatic theology," end quote. Goldziher, who's somebody who doesn't care about any of these theologies, right and wrong, writing as a historian, a factual person, he is saying that the Nizamiya is what won the battle for orthodoxy against the Mu'tazilites on the one hand and against the Hanbalites for the other. And as we mentioned, Al-Ghazali being chosen to be the rector of the university is also an important cause. And again, I'm being very sensitive, guys, so please just understand what I'm saying here. Why are certain figures more famous than others? Why are certain figures considered to be the end-all and be-all? There are many factors involved. Of them, no doubt, inshallah, some piety and some good and whatnot. But it's always helpful to be boosted by political institutions, and it's always helpful to be given some PR and prestige, by state institutions. So the fact that certain individuals were chosen by the most powerful political leader and were placed in the most prestigious places that could boost their credentials and could make their names mainstream, right? That is no doubt one of the main reasons. I'm not saying it's the only one. It is one of the main reasons why certain individuals have left a far greater mark than perhaps otherwise they would have left had it not been for the political boost and for the prestige given to them by the authorities in charge. So, going back to our story here, I quickly went over in my dissertation the professors that were all hired by the Nizamiya and the professors of Aqeedah in particular, and I showed there that every single professor in the first, as long as we have documented, were well-known Ash'ari scholars, and more than one of these professors made a public appeal to Ash'arism, and a number of them, they did cause a little bit of fitna in Baghdad, but nothing major as the time of Al-Qushayri had ever happened after this point in time. So the evidence is very clear in this regard that the primary purpose of Nizam al-Mulk, the primary purpose of Nizam al-Mulk in building the Nizamiya was actually to spread a doctrine that he felt was the better of the two. Nothing wrong with that, everybody does that. And that happened to be Ash'arism, and it also happened to be a Shafi'i version of Islam. Hence, this notion of traditional Islam being the Shafi'i, Ash'ari orthodoxy with a little bit of, tasawwuf, whatnot in it, right? A lot of this goes back to one particular individual who happened to be at the right time and place and who was boosted by the powers that be to be given that position. Again, I'm not the only one saying this. Another modern historian of intellectual Islam, Richard Boulier, he writes, and I quote directly from his book, Islam from the Edge, a really interesting book, and I encourage anybody who's interested to read from it. He writes, Ash'ari theology, listen to this is really simple and to the point. Ash'ari theology, therefore, was an Iranian export to the Arab world. Ash'ari theology was an Iranian export. Why Iranian? Because all of the major movers and shakers of Ash'arism were in Khurasan, were in Iran. By the way, footnote here, Iran had nothing to do with Shi'ism up until the Safavid time, which is only recent, is yesterday, 500 years ago. And inshallah, one day I plan to give a library chat, maybe sometime in the future, about how Iran came from a bastion of Sunnism to a bastion of 12 Shi'ism. This only happened literally during the time of the Ottomans. Iran had nothing to do with Shi'ism for its entire history up until the time of the Safavids. So back to Richard Boulier. Ash'ari theology, therefore, was an Iranian export to the Arab world in the late 11th century i.e. CE. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali looms historically as the definitive codifier and paramount disseminator of Ash'ari thought, right? Again, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Why is his name so popular, so well known? One of the main reasons, he happened to be at the right time, the right place, the first rector, the Nizamiya of Baghdad, back to the quote here. But scores of lesser Iranian scholars carried the message abroad, not just to Iraq and Syria, but to Anatolia, i.e. Turkey, and to India as well. And the new madrasa, supervised by expatriate Iranians or their students, provided the institutional environment for exposing people to the new theology. Later he writes, again this is Richard Boulier, for the first time Islam developed a non-governmental center in the form of a near consensus on the basic beliefs and forms of Sunni Islam. This history of this center was then understandably retrojected, back projected to the earliest period in Islamic history. But to a large extent, it was a center created by social currents that had originated on the edges of Islamic society in Iran, end quote. I.e., traditionalism, mainstream Sunni orthodoxy as understood by the Ash'ari strand, as Richard Boulier writes, was constructed on the peripheries, on the edges in Nishapur, Juwayni and Ghazali in particular. And because of the Nizamiya, and because of a series of institutes that copied the syllabus of Baghdad, and because Ghazali was the one in charge of the syllabus, after Shirazi died and moved out, Ghazali took charge of the most prestigious institute of the Muslim world that became the mother university. It became the primary Ivy League university from which all other universities would take from. And Ghazali's curriculum, and Ghazali's thoughts, and Ghazali's books, and the persona of Ghazali became what is considered to be mainstream. And this is something that, again, a lot of people, even the Hanabila, understood at the time. So, for example, Ibn Aqil, who is a next generation. Ibn Aqil is coming at the next generation. He was a young man when Nizam al-Mulk was in power. Ibn Aqil writes that we have seen in our youth religious intellectuals, ascetics, and great persons with whom it is agreeable to associate. As for Nizam al-Mulk, his conduct dazzled the mind by his liberality, nobility, and decorum, and by his revitalization of the landmarks of religion. He founded colleges of law and instituted charitable trusts for them. He gave new life to learning, lifted the spirits of his people, reconstructed the two holy cities, built libraries, and brought books for them. Thus, knowledge flourished in his day. End quote. Ibn Aqil is pointing out the role of Nizam al-Mulk in spreading certain ideas through institutes and through libraries. So the Nizamiya, therefore, was the first systemized madrasa in the entire Muslim world. But it wasn't the only. Within a century and a half after the founding of the first Nizamiya, there were over 30 similar madrasas in Baghdad alone, and over 50 in Damascus. In Mecca, the first such madrasa based on the curriculum of the Nizamiya was founded in 571/1175. In Tunis in 650/1252. In Andalus 651/1253. A decade later, it reached the shores of India under the Delhi Sultanate, and the first Indian madrasas opened up. And there is much evidence to suggest that the Western concept of universities acquired not just the idea of higher learning, but also many aspects of university protocol, from even the clothing and the curriculum type and professors coming together and whatnot from their Eastern neighbors. So the madrasa concept caught on fire and it spread throughout the Muslim world. What's going to happen when a madrasa opens up? Who's going to teach at these madrasas? As the madrasas were formed, they desperately needed teachers. And the graduates of the Nizamiya desperately needed jobs. In effect, the Nizamiya of Nizam al-Mulk taught the teachers. They trained the teachers. And these teachers, after graduating batches and batches of other students, these teachers were then hired by other madrasas that were opening up across the Muslim world. And because the Nizamiya was the most prestigious and the highest and really the most coveted, understandably the curriculum and the ideas and yes, the theology and the books of the main person who did all of this, i.e. Al-Ghazali, became something that spread across the Muslim world, and Ash'arism secured for itself an unprecedented place in the masjids and madrasas and towns and villages across the Muslim world. It was indeed a perfect match, and one that helped to standardize much of what would become traditionalism or mainstream Islam, which is frankly a Shafi'i Ash'ari orthodoxy, and also would make Abu Hamid al-Ghazali a household name. So, simple example here, that Nizam al-Mulk's efforts in Baghdad became the gold standard for any other ruler and vizier after him. A century later, Nuruddin Zengi died 569. He decided to build a number of madrasas, and he called them the Nuriyya. Ibn Jubayr, the famous traveler, visited the Nuriyya in Syria, and he said, it is perhaps the most beautiful madrasa in the world. It is like a magnificent palace, because the sultans, they want to impress the people. I mean, this is reality. I'm sorry if this sounds sarcastic, or it's not. It's the reality. Every leader needs to win the hearts of his people, and there are multiple ways to what do his people want. Well, a Muslim ruler, and again, I mean, it's good they do this. We appreciate them to print the Qurans and make a massive printing complex and to build the haramains and whatnot. Yeah, whether they did it for Allah and whatnot, that's between them and Allah, but it is undeniable that rulers need to win the hearts of their people. And when you have a religious folk, one of the ways to do that is by doing things that are religious, building beautiful madrasas. So Nuruddin al-Zangi builds the Nuriyya, just like Nizam al-Mulk built the Nizamiya. And the Nuriyya were across the Syrian lands, in Homs, in Hama, in Halab, in Ba'labak, right? And in Mosul as well, he built one. And he placed in Mosul one of the most famous Ash'ari theologians, Abu Bakr al-Burqani. Abu Bakr al-Burqani was a student of the main student of Al-Ghazali. And Nuruddin also built the largest Darul Hadith in Damascus, and he gifted it as the rector to the most famous Ash'ari theologian alive, and that is Al-Hafidh Ibn Asakir. Ibn Asakir was himself a graduate of the Nizamiya of Baghdad, the Ivy League. He was a graduate of there. He comes back, and Nuruddin al-Zangi hands him over this massive institution and basically says, it's all yours, do with it as you please. And in Halab, Nuruddin al-Zangi handed the Nuriyya over to Abu Ma'ali Mas'ud ibn Muhammad al-Naysapuri, who was a professor of the Nizamiya in Naishapur, and it was in Halab, in the Nizamiya, in the Nuriya. It was in this Nuriya that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, as a young child, studied Islam, and he graduated, and as a part of his curriculum, he studied an Ash'ari text written by Abu Ma'ali himself, and he memorized this text. And so when Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, and again all of this is going back to the Nizamiya, it's a chain, you can literally connect the dots. This isn't just some vague stuff. I have connected the dots in my dissertation. You can literally connect the dots about how the madrasas are spreading, where the teachers are coming from, who the next influential people are. And so when Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi comes to power, he follows the footsteps of Nuruddin al-Zangi and of Nizam al-Mulk, and he also sponsors educational institutes as a means of political support, as a means of spreading what he thinks, what he wants to do. And so under the Fatimids, because Salah ad-Din Ayyubi was first a minister for the Fatimids, he worked for the Fatimids. Under the Fatimids, he manages to bring in a very famous Ash'ari scholar by the name of Ibn Darbas al-Shafi'i. Ibn Darbas wrote a book called Risala fi al-Dhabb an Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, a treatise in defense of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. And Salah ad-Din eventually, after the Fatimids were overthrown, Salah ad-Din converts all of the Shia madrasas to Sunni Ash'ari madrasas. The most famous, of course, in Egypt was Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar was founded by the Fatimids. Al-Azhar was a Shi'i Ismaili institute founded by the Fatimids. By the way, Al-Azhar was the term da'wah and da'i, even though it is Islamic, obviously, but it became popular via Al-Azhar and the Fatimids. The first du'at that were publicly called, this is a da'i, calling to Allah Azza wa Jal. Actually, the Fatimids popularized the term. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just istilah, in this regard. Bismillah. Before this point in time, you didn't call a preacher a da'i. The Fatimids were the one who popularized. Nothing wrong with it, as I said. It's all istilahi. So Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, when he became in charge of Egypt, he wanted to get rid of all of the Shi'i influences. By the way, Fatimid Shi'ism is not like what we call Nizari Aga Khani. Fatimid Shi'ism is like the Bohris. And the Bohras, they outwardly are religious, they have the hijab, they read 5 times a day, they read the Quran, they memorize the Quran. Unlike their cousins, the Nizaris went a totally separate way, and perhaps another library chat will go into the differences between all the different Shi'i strands. The Nizari Aga Khani Ismailis are radically different than their cousins, the Bohra. And the Bohra, from our perspective, are much closer even to Ithna Asharism, even though their strands, in fact, in many ways, they are even closer to Sunnism in some ways, and in some ways they are, different. In any case, the point being that when we say Ismailis, you should not think of Aga Khanis. Aga Khanis are one modern branch of Ismailis. When we say Ismailis of the Fatimid era, you should think of people like the Bohra. The Bohra to this day, they study the books written by the Fatimid ulama, such as Al-Qa'im. I know the name is late at night, but you can look them up, and the Bohra books are well known, and you can find them online and purchase them and whatnot. Point being that Salah ad-Din took the institutes of the Fatimids and Sunniized them, but he didn't just Sunniize them, generic Sunnism. He Ash'aratized them, right? And he also instituted a series of madrasas new. Not only did the Shia ones become Sunni Ash'ari, Salah ad-Din, started a series of madrasas in his time, which obviously, what did you think he's going to call them? Not the Nizamiya, not the Nuriya. He calls them the Salihiyas. And so he starts another series of Salihiyas. Where do you think the professors of the Salihiyas are going to come from? Where do you think the teachers are going to come from? Once again, these are the graduates of the Nuriyas, the graduates of the Nizamiyas, and Salah ad-Din was very clear. And again, we love him, he was a great person, but again, politics and theology always intertwine. It is the reality of history. And Salah ad-Din was raised in the Ash'ari school because he went through the Nuriya systems, because that was connected to the Nizamiyas, and he felt this was the better and the correct way. And so he was close to the Ash'ari ulama, so much so that when Ibn Asakir died, the most famous Ash'ari scholar Ibn Asakir, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi made it a point to attend his janazah, and he was present and prayed over him. So Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi was the first person to open up Sunni madrasas in Egypt. Now, this is something that will sound strange to you, but Egypt was not a primary center of Islamic knowledge. for its early time frame. It really took center stage after the Mamluks, to be honest. It really became central after the Mamluks, when the Mongols came and the Mamluks managed to repel the invasion of the Mongols. That's when Egypt started becoming center. Up until this point in time, even during the time of Salah ad-Din, Egypt was kind of, in the peripheries. It wasn't considered to be the one of the main icons of Islamic scholarship. Still, it's going to become very famous. Right now, it has no madrasas other than Shi'i madrasas. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi gets rid of all the Shi'i madrasas and he converts them to Sunni, and most famous is Al-Azhar, and he also institutes his own madrasas, as we said, and therefore Egypt becomes Ash'ari Shafi'i. Egypt becomes Ash'ari Shafi'i under the reign of Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. And he puts in charge of the largest institute a famous scholar by the name of Najmuddin al-Khubushani, who dies 587 Hijri, died 1191 CE. And al-Khubushani, Salah ad-Din loved him. Salah ad-Din admired him. Al-Dhahabi says, وَكَانَ يَعْتَقِدُ فِيهِ, that Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi believed al-Khubushani to be a very pious wali and awliya and a righteous man. Now, Al-Khubushani, so he's appointed by Salah ad-Din to be in charge of the largest madrasa that was built by Salah ad-Din, the Salihiyya that was built by Salah ad-Din in Egypt. Where was it built? It was built symbolically, listen to this, connected to the grave of Imam al-Shafi'i. And it is still, elements of it are still standing to this day. So Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi builds a massive madrasa, a beautiful madrasa, connects it to the grave of a Shafi'i for symbolic effect, right? And he places Khubushani in charge. Who is this Khubushani? Khubushani, by all accounts, was an ardent, overzealous, fanatical bigot against everybody outside of Ash'arism. He hated the Hanbalis with a passion, and he hated everybody else with a passion as well. One of those bigoted, narrow-minded sectarian people. You want to give an example? You want me to give you an example of Khubushani? The books of history tell us that when this new madrasa was being built around the grave of Imam al-Shafi'i, there was a Hanbali scholar who had been buried close to the grave of a Shafi'i, and the school was being built over there. Al-Khubushani jumped into that person's grave, dug it out, and started throwing the bones of this man far, far away, and saying, Hada Hashawi. This person is a Hashawi, the derogatory term that they use for the Hanabila. This person is a Hashawi. It is not allowed for the Zindiq and the Mubtadi' to be buried next to Imam al-Shafi'i. They cannot be in the same place. And this shows us the level of fanaticism. Al-Khubushani also wrote a plaque outside of the madrasa. This plaque was actually examined as recently as 100 years ago. There's an article in one of the archaeological magazines. You can look it up. You can look at this. It's on JSTOR. It's called The Mausoleum of Imam al-Shafi'i by Stephanie Mulder. I read this myself. You can read it yourself too. By the way, all of the references in today's lecture, you will find them in my dissertation, except for this one. That's why I'm giving it, because this was research I did after the dissertation. Everything else I have said, it's summarized. It is a summary of my chapter 1, which is, you will find this here and there. You can see this online, inshallah, or somewhere people are spreading the dissertation as it is. So Allah understand. Anyway, this aspect, Al-Khubushani's efforts and whatnot, I've also done a little bit of research, so you can look up this article, The Mausoleum of Imam al-Shafi'i. Somebody examined the madrasa and the remnants of the madrasa, and they saw the plaque. And on that plaque, it says that this is a madrasa for the people that are called the people of Tawheed, al-Muwahhida, the Ash'ariyya, al-Mansurati ala al-Hashawiyyati wa ghayrihim min al-Mubtadi'ati. The Ash'ari, the al-Mawsufina bil-Usuliyyati al-Ash'ariyyati al-Muwahhidati. So these are people that are called the people of Tawheed, the people of Usul, and the people of the Ash'ari school, al-Mansurati ala al-Hashawiyyati wa ghayrihim min al-Mubtadi'ati. The ones who shall always prevail over the Hashawis, meaning the Hanbalis, and the other people of Bid'ah. Guys, this was on the plaque outside the school. This was the entrance to the school. This is a school for the Ash'aris, the people of Tawheed, the people of Usul, who shall always win over the Hanbalis, or they called them the Hashawis at the time. So it clearly shows that from the beginning of the Sunniization of Egypt, because again, before this time, Egypt for 150 years was basically under the more than 150 years was under the rule of the Fatimids, right? So the Fatimids are kicked out. Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi brings in for the first time Sunni madrasas, and we have Khobushani put in charge of the Sunni madrasas, the largest Sunni madrasa. And this is this guy who takes Hanbali bones and throws them out and has a plaque. So what do you think is going to happen, right? So you have that level. And by the way, again, guys, Yani subhanallah, this is fanaticism of the Ash'aris, but wallahi, the fanaticism of the Hanbalis is exactly the same. It's nothing, both sides are fanatical. So when I point this out, please don't think that I'm kind of sort of trying to take a dig at the Ash'aris. Wallahi, I swear by Allah, that's not my intention, it's not my desire. And I'll tell you factually, there are fanatics to this day in the Ash'ari school, and there are fanatics in this day in the Salafi Hanbali school. It is what it is, and we find this from the beginning of time. And by the way, please, my Ash'ari brethren, you use the adab card in our times. That's not the case. Historically, both schools have had their negative people, and they still do to this day. You have people, and the other group has people that makes blatant tabdi' of the other. And I say enough is enough. Subhanallah, what is the fa'idah of all of this? Wallahi, 95% of the ummah, 98% of the ummah is clueless with regards to these differences. And the problem is, I'm going into a tangent here, the problem is your ilzam of the madhab of your opponent is not the madhab of your opponent. Oh, students of knowledge, understand what I'm saying here. If X, then Y. Y is kufr, so X is kufr. This is the problem. If X, then Y. This if X, then Y is in your mind. If you say istawa means something, this implies something. This implication is kufr, therefore the initial position is kufr. Dear people of both sides, if X then Y is not what the other group says or believes. That's coming from your imagination. If you understood this point, that lazimul madhhabi laysa bil madhhab, what is you think is a corollary of their madhhab is not their madhhab. If you understood this point, then much of the fanaticism would go away. Point being, back to our story over here, and wallahi, this deserves a lot more library chats, and inshallah one day I will, and that's one of the reasons why I have left all of these, because I understand now what I did not understand 15, 20 years ago, and I contextualize what I didn't contextualize before. And in my humble opinion, even the Atharis have gone too far in this affirmation, and the Ash'aris have gone too far in their negation, and the correct opinion, quote unquote, is actually not even as precise as both sides mention it. It really, anyway, maybe one day I'll give you what I think is the stronger opinion, but that's just my opinion in the end of the day. Whatever your opinion is, you definitely don't need to make tabdi' of the other, much less takfir, much less kill the other person. In any case, let's get back to our story and let's wrap up inshallah ta'ala. So Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi was a ardent Ash'ari, and I'm saying this factually. He was an ardent Ash'ari. We love him for what he has done, and so what if he had this interpretation of Islam? I think it's fine, no big deal. But he wanted to spread it, like Nuruddin al-Zangi and like Nizam al-Mulk. And Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi commissioned one of the scholars of his time by the name of Muhammad ibn Hibatullah al-Makki to write a creed that he wanted to make mandatory in his Salahiyya madrasas, or Salahiyya madrasas. And this scholar wrote Hada'iq al-Fusul wa Jawahir al-Uqul, the garden of the seasons and the jewels of the intellect. And this little book became the standard book in Egypt and in Bilad al-Sham, wherever Salah ad-Din was in power. This became the standard book that was to be taught to high school level, middle school level, and university level. Basically all of the kutab, not even the jami'at, the kutab. The kutab is like the children's school, and it became the standard textbook, and this textbook is pure Ash'ari theology. Hence, Ash'arism spread amongst the masses in regions where it had never even been heard of up until that point in time. And the same continued in the time of the Ayyubids. In the time of the Ayyubids, over 130 madrasas, at least 130 madrasas were built in Egypt and Syria. Not a single one of them taught Hanbali theology. Not a single one. And eventually in the time of the Mamluks as well, this continued on. And therefore, this is, in short, a summary of how Ash'arism became dominant throughout the Muslim land. I'm not the one saying this, guys. Yes, I did do some research that others have not done. But let me quote you Where is it? Here's the book. I still have it lying here because I was doing another research here. This is one of my most famous, interesting books. Really, this is an amazing book. كتاب المواعظ والاعتبار بذكر الخطط والآثار المعروف بالخطط المقريزية. This is by a famous historian, Al-Maqrizi, who died 845 Hijrah. Al-Maqrizi died 845 Hijrah. And Al-Maqrizi is not Athari, he's not Salafi, he's not Hanbali, he's not Shafi'i, he's not Ash'ari. Al-Maqrizi is an intellectual historian. Al-Maqrizi really is somebody who's somewhat neutral in this regard. And he has an amazing passage in volume 2, page 342. I have it translated as well, but you can look out the original here. And so listen to this. This is Al-Maqrizi. This is not Goldziher. This is not Boulier. This is not Yasir Qadhi. This is Maqrizi. Listen to Maqrizi. Al-Maqrizi writes, regarding Aqidah, the Sultan Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi hamal al-nas. He carried the people. He hamal al-nas. He forced the people, but he pushed the people upon the beliefs of Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Ismail al-Ash'ari, the student of Abu Ali al-Jubba'i. He made this creed a necessary requirement to be taught in all of his madrasas in Egypt, such as al-Madrasa al-Nasiriyya, located next to the grave of Imam al-Shafi'i, the one I told you about, Khubushani, and the other one which is known as al-Sharifa, and on and on. Thus, from his time onwards, the theology of al-Ash'ari remains status quo in Egypt, in Sham, in the Hijaz, in Yemen, in fact even in the Maghrib, as Ibn Tumart had introduced Ash'arism over there. Pause here, footnote. Ibn Tumart definitely deserves an entire other library chat. Ibn Tumart's rise was also indirectly influenced by the Nizamiya. Ibn Tumart was a die-hard fanatical Ash'ari who killed people, who murdered people who were not Ash'ari. He was in the Maghrib. And Ibn Tumart came a little bit after Al-Ghazali. Ibn Tumart was spreading his ideas in the Maghrib, and the Nizamiya was doing its stuff in the middle, or the main part of the Muslim world, in the Hijaz and other places. Back to Al-Maqrizi. So Al-Maqrizi says that the theology of Al-Ash'ari became status quo in Egypt and in Sham, in Hijaz and Yemen, and in Al-Maghrib, Ibn Tumart had introduced doctrines over there. Thus, this is Al-Maqrizi. What occurred was that this theology, this aqidah, became so muntashir in these lands that whoever opposed it would have his neck cut off, either metaphorically or for real. And this remains the case up until our times. Al-Maqrizi dies 845, right? There were not in the Ayyubid lands many followers of Abu Hanifa or Ahmad ibn Hanbal, but these two madhabs did become popular in other places afterwards, right? So Abu Hanifa's madhab, and he means here the Maturidi school as well, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and he means here the Salafi Athari school, that they were not popular in Bilad al-Sham under the Ayyubids. They were not popular in Egypt, but they were pockets here and there, and they remained popular in other places. End quote here. This observation from Al-Maqrizi explicitly indicates the Ash'aratization that occurred in that time frame and following these efforts. And in fact, the Egyptian experience was even more advantageous to the Ash'ari school than the Baghdadi/Iraqi one, because in Egypt there were no strong footholds of any other strand of Sunnism to oppose them. Egypt was empty slate after the Fatimids. It was Fatimi. There were no Sunni madrasas. Egypt didn't have the intellectual output that any of the other places had. And it wasn't going to become center stage until another few hundred years. So Egypt was a faraway region, relatively speaking, intellectually, and it was a neutral place at the time. And so by wiping away Fatimid Shi'ism, replacing it with Sunni Ash'arism, and then the Mongol invasion wiped out most of the intellectual centers of the Muslim world, Egypt comes to center stage, and therefore what happened to be Sunni, Shafi'i, Ash'ari, Ghazalian Islam in Egypt eventually became dominant in much of the Arab-speaking world, again for later historical reasons. Where did it all come from? It started all the way back to Nizam al-Mulk and the Nizamiya. So to wrap up, the primary thesis that I am advocating, and frankly, not just me, anybody who studies history knows this, right, is that the dominance of the Ash'ari school and theology is due exclusively, like primarily, the number one reason to the function and role of the government-sponsored Nizamiya madrasas introduced by Nizam al-Mulk and then emulated elsewhere. And even some of the Hanabila, they kind of felt this, such as Ibn Qudama, who's writing a century and a half after Nizam al-Mulk. Ibn Qudama, he laments in Damascus, he laments the spread of Ash'arism, and he considers this to be Akhirul Zaman because of these new ideas. And he says that the Ash'aris are those who, and I quote from his writings here, are people who lust after prestige and high positions and own the madrasas and control the awqaf. And Allah has given them this world but deprived them of religion. Again, this is Ibn Qudama here. For they are always at the abwab al-salatin. Ironic here because the table has turned and modern Ash'aris have accused modern Salafis of being at the abwab al-salatin and all rich. But as I say, once you study history, you cannot be a fanatic. This is the way of the world, and it goes in circles. One day a group is in power and money, another day another group is in power and money. And the fact that one group is in power is not an indication that it is the better group. This is just the reality, and it doesn't mean anything. In the end of the day, harsh polemics aside, Ibn Qudama is hurt. He's painfully aware of the advantage that Ash'ari scholars have in procuring the madaris and in having control over the awqaf that the Hanabila used to have in Baghdad. Because again, they had that position, but it was lost to them after the Seljuqs and Nizam al-Mulk. Thus, the relatively minor role that Ash'arism had played prior to this stage is well documented. And all you need to do is to read the writings of the early Ash'aris to see this. Ibn Asakir, who is kind of sort of the interim, like Ash'arism hasn't become mainstream yet. Ibn Asakir is seeing the rise, but still Hanbali Islam, Sunnism is stronger. Ibn Asakir, in his Tabyin Kadhib al-Muftari, he actually lists a few dozen Ash'ari scholars in the span of 2.5 centuries. And he goes to great lengths in order to reconcile the well-known traditionalist dislike of kalam with the Ash'ari use of kalam. And as late as 537 Hijri, still we find an incident between the Ash'aris and between the Hanabila, and minor things happen. Eventually, all of this is relegated to the footnotes of history, and Ash'arism becomes the dominant school, and Hanbalis become the minority, even in Baghdad, such that when Ibn Taymiyyah comes along, around 2 centuries plus after the first Nizamiya opened, when Ibn Taymiyyah comes along, he finds the tables have turned from the time of Al-Sharif Abu Jafar, from the time of Al-Barbahari. And one of the reasons why Ibn Taymiyyah is so harsh against the Ash'aris, and he is harsh against the Ash'aris, I'm going to be the first to say this, one of the reasons is that he wants to regain that foothold that once upon a time Hanbalis had and they no longer have. Thus, through the Nizamiya, the teachings of a hitherto small and relatively obscure group spread through the Muslim lands. And Ash'arism established itself in cities which had previously never heard of it or been close to it, and in particular the Islamic capital of Baghdad. Coupled with the intellectual vacuum that had been created by the displacements of the Shi'i Buwayhid dynasties in the Arab heartlands, and eventually of the Ismaili Fatimids in Egypt, along with the complete lack of any alternative network of madrasas, the various Nizamiyas and the madrasas that were spawned as a result of the Nizamiyas proved to be the single most effective and powerful cause for the spread and eventual dominance of this strand of Sunni Islam, viz. Ash'ari Islam, through the thought in particular of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Thus, from the time of the Seljuqs, and then the Umayyads, the Seljuqs, and then the Ayyubids, and then through Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi's mini dynasties that broke up after the Crusades, and then the Mamluk lands, all of these institutes that opened up, they brought forth teachers that were trained either directly from the Nizamiya or from institutes that were trained from the Nizamiya. And the innovative idea introduced by Nizam al-Mulk of controlling the religious class by making it somewhat indirectly but still directly in its own way dependent on the state was so successful that it continued to be co-opted and adopted throughout the Muslim world, and perhaps it reached its pinnacle under the time of the Ottoman Empire, where the religious establishment was completely absorbed into the state bureaucracy, as the students of Ottoman history know. Bottom line, politics had a lot to do, actually everything to do, with the dominance of this one school. And if you study history, you understand this point. In the end of the day, the fact that one school is more popular at one time and place means nothing. In my humble opinion, all of these strands are not between haqq and batil. That's really the main point. Yes, I'll be the first to say generic Islam is going to be correct Islam, because the belief of the awam, the belief of the Muslim masses, is overall protected. They believe in Allah, they want to worship Allah, they believe they want to follow the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah, they respect the Sahaba. This is general mainstream Islam. But the advanced disputations that occur between them, the fact that one strand is popular in one time over another, means absolutely nothing. Fi kullin khair, and it is a mistake, and we see historically it was a mistake to make these issues so big, such that people are fighting, people are dying, people are considered deviant and whatnot. And especially in our times when so much is going on in the world, it makes no sense to take a person who loves Allah, a person who memorizes the Quran, a person who genuinely is interested in the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah, as your enemy. Even if you disagree with adab, understand that that person is just as sincere as you, and understand, this is the key point, that what you think his position necessitates, even if you are certain it necessitates it, the person in front of you whom you're debating with does not view that the position necessitates this. That's the whole point here, right? Whatever you believe in, and then you think if you disagree with this, it means something else, realize the other person doesn't go to it means something else. That's in your mind and not in the other person's mind. In the end of the day, Allah Azza wa Jalla knows best, and inshallah we'll continue with other topics. So I'm going to take a break with the whole kalam and Sunni and Ash'ari and whatnot. I want to do some other library tests inshallah about other topics that I'm interested in. Unfortunately, or whatever it might be, I had to stay here because I'm developing a whole series, and I had a super long library chat so that we are now done with this whole notion of the rise of Sunni kalam and Ash'arism and whatnot. So I'm going to take a break and go into other topics for a while, and then inshallah come back and talk about some other topics, such as, for example, what my own opinions are. Hanbali Islam, by the way, another topic I love. The notion of Hanbalism being one monolithic. No, Ibn Taymiyyah was one strand. Ibn Qudama was a different strand. Al-Sharif Abu Jafar is yet another strand. Ibn Aqil is another strand. Ibn al-Jawzi is another strand. Just like with the Ash'aris, by the way, Al-Ghazali is one strand. Razi is another strand. Every individual thinker, they're coming from a school, but they're bringing something new. It is only the complete ignorant student who thinks that everybody's exactly the same, monolithic. No, that's not the case. Every person comes and brings forth something slightly new. The very fact they're bringing forth something slightly new, modifying, it shows you that it's not as black and white. It shows you that a lot of these issues are not Quran and Sunnah. They're extrapolated from the Quran and Sunnah, and in that extrapolation there's a human element, and that is why Ash'arism and Atharism and Maturidism and Mu'tazilism and every ism is, in the end of the day, something that human beings have done, taking from what Allah has revealed, and therefore our wala and bara and our love and hatred should not be based upon the interpretations of men. It should be based upon what Allah and His Messenger said. And that is why, in my humble opinion, and with this I conclude, the hadith of Jibreel is what we make wala and bara on. Anybody who accepts the arkan of the hadith of Jibreel, anybody who wants to be a Muslim via following the 5 pillars of Islam, that generally speaking, they are within mainstream Islam and mainstream orthodoxy, and all the differences after this, there are differences of preferences we can discuss within one family, and they are not mubtadi', dal, mudil, much less kafir. No, this is a mistake. It should never have been done. And I hope inshallah with this I have clarified why one strand became dominant over another. And wa jazakumullahu khairan. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
فيا ذلي ويا خجلي إذا ما قال لي ربي أما استحييته تعصيني ولا تخشى من العتب وتخفي الذنب عن خلقي وتأبى في الهوى قربي فتب مما جنيت عسى تعود إلى رضا ربي